photos and stuff to have a little bit of background. The first portion of this is going to be fairly back to basics, just because I want to make sure everybody has a good feel for how the technology works and stuff. Don't worry, I'm not going to get very heavy on semiconductor theory or anything like that, so don't worry. We're going to talk a little bit about advantages of DSLRs over other types of imaging. A little bit of basics on the cameras and sensors, a little bit on pixels and so on. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to read a histogram and exposure, some basic starter settings, and I'll carry it forward onto that next month as well when we start talking about actually doing tracking and lens choices for doing various types of photography, just to kind of give you an overview. And then next month, like I said, we'll talk about lenses and adapters, adapting the camera to the telescope, different types of tracking mounts and options that you can do, as well as accessories, and we'll also talk a little bit about how to reduce your image noise and so on. And basic processing workflow, I won't get into how to process an image because Richard did a fantastic job last month. We'll just kind of get you to where you would have a tip or a fits kind of thing, just sort of a basic overview of that, and then that way you can carry forward with whichever type of software you want to use. So why would we use a DSLR? There's many people that use actually in our club that use DSLRs. I think the biggest one is the ease of use and setup. It's very easy to use these. There's a wide range of cameras available in the market. They're lightweight and portable, and they're also multifunctional. So you can use them, just like when I was talking about binoculars before, you can use them in your day-to-day things. If you're going traveling or hiking, you can take photos. Some people like to do bird watching as well. Well, now you can use it to shoot skyscape photography as well. Or maybe you're using it for landscapes or something like that. I think the big advantage over some of the astrocams, the dedicated astrocams, depending on what you're looking at doing and shooting, is the fact that you don't need a computer to run it. It's got an onboard image processor, and it's a much more minimalist type of setup. We'll be talking a little bit more about this next month, but I just thought I'd throw this in. These are some ways that you can obviously hook in a DSLR if you were going to do it with a telescope. And you can see I don't have a lot of extraneous cords and cables off the setup. It can be very easy to set up and easy to use. So there are some advantages there. The basic, for those of you that don't know, I'm sure most people do, but I thought I would just highlight, DSLR stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex, which means we're looking through a single lens both for shooting and for looking at the scene that we're doing. I've got a diagram after this that'll kind of explain that. I'm not going to get into all the different buttons and gizmos on the side of the camera because obviously they're fairly standard, but the form factor kind of followed from 35mm format cameras. And so obviously now a lot of the controls are electronic rather than manual, but again, they assume most people are right-handed and you've got settings that you do and away you go. So the big advantage with the DSLR2 is you can interchange lenses, and you can get adapters, of course, to adapt to like a telescope or other type of telephoto or fancy lens. Another thing here, I always forget where this laser button is. There it is. You also have on the side of most of these cameras extraneous controls, like for a remote control, let's say, to do extended exposures on a bulb setting, as an example. Pardon me. You also have digital interface terminals where you can transfer all your data over to a computer and so on. And if you were shooting, let's say, video, some of them have also an external mic and an HDMI output as well. So you can also do some interesting things there as well. Moving forward, this is what I was saying about a DSLR here. So we basically have the lens here. So before you're shooting, and I know a lot of people have seen this, so I know this seems a little over redundant, but the basic idea here is you have this prism for doing your imaging. And so the mirror is down, so the light comes through the lens, hits this, gets to an erect image, and then you're basically seeing about 90% of the scene or so, 90 to 95 depending on the finder. When you go to actually shoot, now the mirror flips up, and many of you who already have a camera probably heard that famous click. When you go to click, you hear that kind of a, I'm not doing it very well, but anyway, I practiced it earlier. I guess I just didn't do enough practice there. But the shutter opens up, and then what used to be the film plane is now the sensor. And of course, then you do your exposure, then it comes down, and you're ready to shoot your next image. So very basic setup. One of the things that happens, though, now we're starting to see a trend in the industry to go to what's called mirrorless cameras. A lot of the TFT screens and a lot of the Viewfinders that people are using now, they tend to use their screen because it's articulated. It's much easier, especially when you're shooting upwards or doing some sort of funky imaging. You can actually articulate the screen and have a comfortable view of what you're shooting. And I'm not sure if it's going to be a fad or if it's a full-blown trend, but we're starting to see these mirrorless cameras much more because you're getting rid of all this extra mechanical and optical stuff that not everybody's using as much anymore. For an astrophotographer, it actually may be a boon because these end up being much lighter. So an example of a DSLR is like a Canon EOS 6D as an example. Brian uses one for his imaging. We're starting to see now the EOS, there are other camera manufacturers that have these as well. It's just easier to find Canon pictures online with a white background rather than gray or something. But the Canon EOS R is one that's now starting to, is one of their latest cameras that's a mirrorless. And it's a full frame camera, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But you can see I don't have nearly the bulk on that other camera. So you reduce the weight sometimes as high as 30%, which can make a big difference if you're doing astro shooting through a telescope. You're not loading it down nearly as much, so it's kind of nice. Well, when we talk about sensors, that's the heart of the camera other than the lens itself. And basically the camera's a light box, so the heart of it is the sensor. A lot of these smaller sensors here were present when you had a lot of the point-and-shoot cameras. There are still point-and-shoot cameras that do have these smaller sensors in them. The ones we're going to be talking about tonight are these here. They're closer to the size of a 35mm format film. We call it a full-frame sensor when it's almost like very close to or exactly the same size as a 35mm film. In the old days where they used, not that old, but 35mm film, the full-frame sensor emulates that as far as the area. These, what are termed cropped sensors here, I've got a really good diagram on the next slide to explain what that means, but basically it's giving you an effective magnification. So it's slightly smaller than a full frame, and there are implications for that when you go to actually select lenses and so on to do your shooting. So here's an example of like an APS-C or a crop type of lens. Assuming you could actually mate it to your camera, you're going to actually get vignetting here on the side of your full-frame sensor, which obviously you don't want to have because you're wasting, actually extra surface that could have an image to it. When we go to like a full-frame lens here, you can see where we've got the whole frame or almost the whole frame illuminated in this one. Here's where the crop comes in, or where the term crop comes in, because you can imagine with the smaller sensor, we're effectively cropping the image. It's almost as if we took a crop and then blew it back up. What basically happens, and as you can see here, you have a restricted field of view, and again, that's going to have some implications when you go to do any type of shooting, but particularly when you go to do sky shooting, let's say unguided or untracked skyscape photography. You're going to have to bear that in mind because it will affect your exposures and so on. We'll talk about that a little later on in the talk. Every sensor has what we call pixels in them, sensor picture element, and basically, regardless of what colors they respond to, they're basically little light buckets that convert the photons to electrons and ultimately a voltage that the electronics in the camera go and convert into a signal. Okay, that's basically the function there. So the larger bucket you have, obviously the more light it will capture before it gets full. The smaller the bucket size, obviously it'll get full much faster. There are implications to that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Two different primary technologies that are present on sensors are CCDs, charge coupled devices. They were present when, well, they still are available, but CMOS has taken over, complementary metal oxide semiconductor. The main difference between the two, not counting all the semiconductor actions, is that the CCD is a much more passive sensor. So what happens is all of the voltage conversion and amplification are done at the back side of the array. I've got a diagram here just to kind of show this. So basically the light gets converted to a photocurrent and eventually a voltage, and it gets converted over here to a voltage on a CCD, whereas with a CMOS, you actually have some active chip amplification right at the sensor, small amount, and then you also have additional amplification here before it goes to your CPU to do processing. There are pluses and minuses to both. The CCDs, one of the advantages, they have a little bit lower noise, but we're starting to see some huge advances in the CMOS technology, and they're coming pretty close, so it's kind of nice to see. On any type of sensor that you have, this is quite a typical layout for any sort of digital camera. This Bayer system is sort of the industry standard. There are some variants. I think Fuji uses a slightly different one. But basically you have an interwoven waffle pattern here with the pixels for different colors. And you'll notice here we have double the green pixels versus red and blue. The idea here is that it gives you, it's supposed to emulate human vision to a certain extent. We've got a diagram to show that on the next slide. But I also wanted to point out here, when you've got a pixel on an array like this, there's some peripheral circuitry that does take up a little bit of size on the sensor that's involved in, obviously, the voltage to, or sorry, the current to voltage conversion, like I was mentioning before with CMOS. So when you hear effective pixels versus your true pixel size, this is where it comes from. Okay, so a small amount, but it'll have an impact on how big your sensor is. For those of you that attended my talk on human vision a couple of months ago, we were talking about the human eye and the presence of cones on your retina. And again, like I just said a few minutes ago, the idea here is that we have the responses here sort of emulate our human eye to an extent. These cameras are normally used for taking visual photos, so therefore, in general, the idea is you want to have a relatively accurate representation of what you're shooting, because obviously we're looking at a photo and there's a reason for doing that. There are reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. Sometimes artistic license, you might want to have a special effect of color or something. But for all intents and purposes on the white balance, the idea here is to respond and give basically a fairly faithful representation of what you're seeing. Excuse me. So when you look at the breakdown here of a camera, this is basically an exploded view here. So basically, it doesn't matter whether it's a star or whatever, we've got light coming through, hits the sensor, gets converted into, these electrons get converted into a voltage, and then the ISO amplifier is the main amplifier that's responsible for the gain that we get. A lot of people have the misconception that ISO, raising the ISO increases the sensitivity of the pixels. It doesn't, because the ISO, it's almost like a stereo or a CCD player. If you are playing songs and then you turn up the volume, the amplifier is basically taking that lower volume and amplifying it up. That's basically what the ISO setting is doing. You're not actually getting any extra sensitivity on the pixels. The only reason that it appears that way is because of the fact that when you increase the ISO on a shot, you're going to have brighter pixels, like you're going to have a brighter image, and all it is like turning up the volume on your headphone or stereo or whatever. It's the same kind of effect. Just before all the electronic circuitry on the actual camera side, all of the noise control, if we're going to have any at all, is really on this side of it. So things like cooling the sensor. Some astrocams can actually have cooled sensors in them. Some guys actually even have special cooling units to cool their DSLR as well. Apparently they're not cheap, but there is a way to do that. And that helps reduce the noise on the sensor side. And then of course managing your ISO, I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but managing your ISO to give you kind of the best balance between image brightness and noise and so on will help a lot as well. We can't really do much on the back end here because this is all fixed with the circuitry, although noise control in general on electronic circuits has come a long way over the years, and will continue to. Some of you may have heard the term pixel pitch before, and so you can imagine if you have two sensors. These ones are APS-C type cameras. One has slightly more pixels than the other. This one's a 15.1 megapixel versus just about 18 megapixel. The effective pixel size here is going to be quite different here, and this will have implications when you look at how your signal-to-noise ratio versus resolution will be, okay? And that's very important to be mindful of that. Are there pluses and minuses to both? Yes, but it depends on the kind of shooting you're going to do and how sensitive you need the variance in brightness levels to be able to dig out the finest details that you want, let's say in a sky shot. So as an example here, we have various cameras, and as you go to the left, or sorry, to the right, you can see we have smaller pixels, so therefore we have finer resolution. So if I'm using a camera for shooting the moon, obviously I've got lots of light. I don't really have to worry as much about signal-to-noise ratio because I've got lots of signal, right? I want detail. But when we go the other way, you have larger pixels, so that means the buckets are... Imagine, let's say I have two buckets, one's twice as large as the other, and I have a fixed amount of sand that I'm putting in both of them. That's your noise, okay? And then as I fill them up with water, Obviously, if I fill them up halfway, I have more water versus, or sorry, more sand versus water on the smaller bucket than it would on the larger. That's sort of what we're talking about here, okay, for all intents and purposes. Now, if you look at, this is a representative graph showing kind of the state of the art right now. You'll notice the Canon 6D is fairly high up there. There are a couple of very good Nikons as well in here. And it's by no means fully representative of every camera out on the market. There's a lot of them, obviously, but this just kind of gives you an overview. You can see film is down here. So where we have signal to noise ratio and pixel, or in this case, grain size on a film, you can see that we far exceeded film many years ago. And even a very simple point-and-shoot camera is well above film already. So no disparagement to those that still like to do old-school shooting film, but you're kind of taking a knife to a gunfight a little bit now at this point. Okay. Dynamic ranges obviously increases as we go up, and the detail or more resolution as we go towards the left-hand side there. So again, there's a bit of a balance there, and that's what I really want to let you know about the takeaway here is, depending on what kind of camera you're choosing and what your budget is, try to find the best balance between those if you can. If you're going to be doing this a lot, like shooting skyscapes and so on. Well, we've talked a lot about cameras, a little bit of sensors and all that stuff, but come on, Darren, we want to hear the good stuff now. So, okay, sounds good. For astrophotography, we're going to shoot in manual mode, and there's a lot of reasons for doing that. The basic one is you have full control over the exposure, and I'll be talking about the exposure triangle in just a second or two, but I just want to be mindful that if you have a camera with settings wheel like this, you always want to put it on M or manual. If you're fairly new at using a camera, make sure you find out how to do that. You also want to put your lens, if you're using a lens that's on the camera, in manual focus mode as well. You're going to be doing everything manually. Most autofocuses have a real tough time trying to focus to infinity if it has nothing to lock onto, and you could get a mixed range of, you might get infinity one time and the next time it goes past infinity, it comes back, or it's not sure what to do and then you can't shoot properly. So always make sure you do that, and turn off your image stabilization as well, because you're going to be mounting this on a fixed mount, whether it's a tripod or something similar, and the image stabilization is trying to wait for you to do something with it. And even with the image stabilized binoculars, like what I use, if I put them on a tripod, they try to swim around, and that'll cause smeared images of stars on your shot if you leave it in in image stabilization mode. So go totally manual when you're doing this. That's the big takeaway here. You'll see this is an example of a Canon, but there's similar screens on Nikons and so on. Basically, the idea here is you want to make sure that you have the shooting mode saying M. You're going to have your shutter speed, your F ratio if you've got a lens that electronically communicates that to the camera. It'll tell you what your F setting is. You'll have your ISO here and so on, and then you also have your exposure control adjustments as well. Normally you're going to leave it at 0. There may be some times where you might want to go up or down a third. I wouldn't push it too much past 2/3 because you're really still effectively affecting the ISO setting in the camera. And that will cause some problems depending if you're not quite comfortable with how your camera is shooting yet. So again, this is kind of what we want to look at. M, and then have a series of things here. Okay, and then of course this is auto white balance. One shot, so it's taking a shot rather than trying to do a rapid succession of images. And then this would be your exposure control. These symbols will represent certain types of exposure depending on what you're shooting. Try to have it in RAW mode if you can, or RAW plus JPEG. Very important when you're shooting, so that way you can still look at the JPEG and share it if you've just taken some shots, but you'll need the RAW format in order to do post-processing properly down the road. So definitely make sure you have that same done too. So when we shoot, the thing that affects the images on a sensor is going to it's going to be the exposure, or how much light hits our sensor. And there's 3 primary things that affect this. There's the aperture, which is the amount of light coming through the lens, not unlike our pupil size, right, on our eyes. The shutter speed, obviously the longer a shutter speed, you're going to get more light coming through. And then of course I talked a little bit about ISO already. That's the amplifier gain coming after the sensor array itself. That's the volume control that we call it. Just a little note about f-stops or f ratings on lenses. Typically what will happen is you'll see a number like f1.4 or f1.8 or something, And in this example here, every full f-stop that I have here is actually having the light. So in other words, the capture area coming, or the amount of area that's allowing the light to come through between 1.4 to 2 or 2 to 2.8 is exactly half the light, which would mean all things being equal, I would have to double my shutter length of time that the shutter's open to get the same type of exposure. Now, there are partial stops as well, like 1.8 was one in this case, 2.2, 2.5, 3.2. A lot of lenses will have that capability, but I just wanted to point out that for these full stops, you're getting exactly half the light coming through in each one of these. The other thing that happens when you go to larger aperture openings or smaller f numbers is you get a shallower depth of field. For those of you that don't know what depth of field is, basically it's the range plus or minus your subject that you're shooting in focus, that it remains in focus. As you go away from that, you're going to get progressively more and more out of focus image. When we're doing astrophotography, it's irrelevant because we're shooting infinity, so infinity plus or minus 1 really doesn't matter. So that doesn't really apply in this case. But if you're using a wide aperture, let's say shooting a friend across a room, you're going to have a blurry wall for sure behind them. And sometimes there's reasons for doing that kind of shooting, but I just wanted to point that out. So the range of f ratios that you're going to want to try and be in this range if you can, or look for a lens that's kind of below f3. If you're going to use a fixed lens for skyscape photography, that's ideal. I've got some examples in a few minutes that will show why that is the case. Basically, you want to be able to get as much light as possible into the sensor and minimize the exposure time, so that way, if you're not trying to get star trails, you want clear, crisp images on your photo. You don't want to have things starting to blur out as the Earth's motion takes over. Oops. So again, just a refresher here, just to remind everybody, so the larger the opening, the brighter the image, the higher the volume on my amplifier, or in this case, the more ISO, I will amplify both the image in this case and whatever noise is in there. So it'll start to get grainier as you get to higher levels, but the image will still be brighter too. And then of course, on the shutter, the longer I leave the shutter open, the more light I get through, so therefore the brighter the image is. So the idea here when we're doing exposures is to find a balance between these three to be able to get the best possible outcome when we're shooting. Now, as I mentioned before, you should try to stay less than 3 or 3.5 at kind of the largest setting if you can for a fixed lens. If you have a camera that has an f4 lens, use what you've got, of course, but ideally you are going to be wanting to go to a shorter f4 at some point. You're going to probably do your exposure times well in excess of a half second, more likely approaching 10, 20, 30 seconds or longer, especially if you're doing tracking. We'll talk about that, like I said, next week. What we're talking about today is taking shots without tracking. So you're going to be 30 seconds and less usually in that case. Most of the, say, cameras in the last 3 or 4 years, you would probably use ISO setting of 800 to 6400 in that range. Will be kind of optimal to start with. Certainly some of the earlier cameras, you're probably going to want to go start at 400 and go to 1600 and see if that works for you, because some of the earlier sensors that were out were prone to a little bit more ISO noise, and so they'll look grainier if you go to higher ISOs. What's happening here is because we're using a fixed aperture typically, we kind of pin down one corner of the triangle, so the only things that we have to control the exposure on our image now is exposure time and ISO. Those are really the two dominant things that we have to, like I said, find the best balance between those in order to get an effective image. Ideally, again, 2.8 or less for an f ratio on a fixed lens would be ideal for doing these kind of shooting. So if I keep the shutter and f-stop constant and I adjust the ISO, you remember that little slider that went up to plus or minus 3? Well, that's what we've done here. Basically what you've done is you've adjusted the exposure value to have the same image brightness, and we fixed the shutter and the aperture or f-stop on the lens. You can see that as I go to the right here, with higher ISO settings, I'm getting more graininess in the image, okay? If I, let's say, leave the ISO fixed and the aperture fixed, and again, now I'm adjusting the shutter, you can see again, I'm starting to get some more graininess as well, and the primary reason for that is I'm not getting enough signal into my sensor, so proportionally I have more sand to my water, like I talked about earlier. So It's kind of interesting because when you increase the ISO, you can go to shorter shutter speeds or lower shutter values. The problem is that both of those will kind of give you more graininess, so you have to find that, again, that best balance. And the only way to do that is to experiment with your camera. There's some basic settings you can start with on the ISO and then experiment with your shutter to see for that particular lens how things look. Yes?
On the time slide that you just had up there, if you look to the left, the 8-second one is showing some of that tracking.
Yeah, I'm not sure what lens this was. Like this, I got this off the net, obviously, but you're right. This would be an example of a lens, probably a moderate telephoto lens. So you're probably already just starting to see it. And thanks for bringing that up. You're right. So this is an example.
Your exposure time, you see that trail.
That's right. So in this particular case, the combination of lens and exposure time here with the ISO setting, you're starting to get trailing already. I have some better examples of that in a few minutes, but thank you for bringing that up. So that's the other trade-off. You want to make sure you don't leave it too long. Exactly. Now, a lot of cameras will have an info setting, and you see that there's a thumbnail. Many of you who have a camera already have seen this before, where you get a thumbnail and then this little histogram here. And that's what we're going to talk about just for a few seconds before we talk about lenses and so on here. So, I always hit that before I do. So this is kind of a blown-up version of a histogram. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the histogram, basically what this is giving you is an indication of, first of all, on the lower axis here, it's basically how full those buckets are. So you either have darker pixels or the shadows, the lower tones, and then on the other side towards the right are the pixels that are more full or are getting brighter because you've got like highlights and bright portions of the image. And of course, in between is your what they call midtones. And then you have population of pixels, or you get more pixels as you go further up. This particular example here is a relatively well-balanced exposure for the most part. And you still have some room here. If this was the saturation point here, you haven't created a flat top or a roof here yet, which means that if this was a shot where I wanted to expand what they call do a histogram stretch, what you're then doing is expanding this to say that this is the brightest that we're seeing here, or this is the largest number of pixels that I have in here. So if I expand that up and say that's the max, you can actually enhance and pull out some finer details sometimes, okay? But you need to leave yourself a little bit of room there, because if you don't, you'll start, when you start to process the image, you can actually start losing detail. In fact, Richard mentioned that last month when he was talking about processing. So again, this is sort of what you have to watch for a little bit. Most of the images that you're going to see when you shoot through a camera, especially skyscape stuff, unless you have like a moonlit mountain in the foreground or something, although you probably wouldn't be shooting long exposures with a moon image to watch out the sky, but let's say you were able to do something like that, you're normally going to see this kind of thing. It'll look like an underexposed image, okay? Because we're shooting things that are very dark. So in this case, it's showing underexposed, but really what it means is that most of our pixels here are fairly, we've got a large number of our pixels that have dark values to them. The pixels aren't really full, right, as far as saturation goes. You might see the odd one, depending on how, if it's a really bright swath of Milky Way, you might see something more like this. But you will, unless you left your shutter open for like 2 hours and forgot or something, you're not going to normally see an overexposed or type thing going on. Now, there's 4 different types of histograms. Most of these cameras, because they use colored sensors, will have, whoops, I didn't mean to do that yet, sorry. Red, green, and blue, and then of course this luminance is a synthesis, and it's used, this formula here is used by, it was originally developed by black and white video cams in the 50s and 60s when they were trying to evaluate how bright something was based on the color spectrum, right? Because they still had black and white and they needed to know the effective luminance that they were getting. And that's kind of carried over to calculating the luminance in a digital camera as well. So you have to remember that, like as an example, this red one here is starting to flatten out a bit here. So you can imagine if I take 0.3, if the luminance doesn't know that this is close to or is already saturated and I've overpopulated here. So if you start seeing a really big spike really close to the top end when you're doing your shooting, take a look at the color information as well, because you might be clipping one of the color channels, in which case that means you have to drop your exposure down a little bit in order to make sure that you can then do some expansion to be able to get the detail, or you start losing some of your red details in the image. So now we'll just get to the good stuff, and then I wrap it up for today. These are some typical questions that a lot of people ask, like what sort of tripod's best, what's lens is better for sky shooting and stuff, and you know, there's a whole range of things that crop up when you want to go do nighttime photography. Now, the first and probably the most important thing is to get a decent tripod, and I would probably hazard a guess that 90% of the tripods that people have with their cameras are borderline adequate or maybe even inadequate for doing general sky photography. The reason I say that is because a lot of them are very lightweight, and depending on the type of camera and lens system you have, you might be right at the edge of the load handling. It's okay when you're shooting, let's say, daylight shots, you know, a wedding or, you know, a friend's birthday party or something, because you're using shutter speeds that are, you know, could be 1/500th or 1/1000th of a second or whatever. That's not going to matter. But when you start setting a camera out, you're going to take a shot and you're going to do a 30-second exposure, 20-second exposure. What ends up happening, if the wind came up, this thing's going to be vibrating all over the place. You're going to have smeared images. So try to get the best tripod you can for the money. I would expect to spend a minimum of $100 to $150 or more on a decent camera tripod. Sometimes you can get them on sale. Bear in mind that depending on the type of head you have here, you can have, like, let's say a ball-style head like this, which works really well for doing this kind of shooting. You can also get a pan head as well if you want. But the idea here is to be able to orient and aim the camera all around depending on what you want to shoot. The nice thing if you get a really decent tripod is it can double up for those of you that also have binoculars. I had to throw that in. You can then use them for a variety of things. You can use your tripod with your binoculars as well. So if you can try and modularize your equipment, it serves you really well, because now you don't need to have a separate thing for each individual thing sometimes. I'll talk a little bit more about that next month, but I just wanted to mention that just because it's very important that people realize that they need to mount the camera fairly steadily. All sorts of different lenses here. We got telephoto, zoom lenses, portraits and primes, and so on. What's the best one for sky photography? Well, before I get into that, I was just going to say you have to also be mindful of the type of shooting you're going to want to do. Just like with an eyepiece, if I had a fixed eyepiece and I went from a shorter focal length telescope to a longer one, I'm going to narrow the field of view because the magnification is going up, okay? Same thing, we've got a fixed sensor, so therefore the longer the focal length of the lens that you have in front of it, the narrower the angle of view that you're going to be able to see with that shot, okay? So here's the formula here for those of you that love math. It's very simple. And S is your sensor dimension here in millimeters. F is your focal length. And the nice thing is you can also use this formula if you decide to attach to a scope as well to get your effective angular view that you want to do. Let's say you want to frame Orion or something. This will give you an idea of what you need to do or what you're going to get with your respective telescope. The main sensors that we would normally be using, again, are these ones, the full frame, APS-H or C, Canon or Nikon. They typically have an aspect ratio of 3 to 2. And so for those of you that remember your Pythagorean days in high school, you can actually calculate a diagonal, and then you just use the diagonal. That's the most common way to do it. Is for those of you that aren't sure, the number is root 13, just so you know. So you can plug that in, and then that gives you the effect of, for your particular sensor, you just use that one parameter, and then you can calculate what the effective field of view is. Okay? I'm going to blank out this right-hand side here because most of these sensors, like I say, are more for the point-and-shoot type cameras. We're talking more of the DSLR style here. So if you look at this one here, these are all diagonal angle of view here. So if we look at a 24 millimeter as an example here, we've got an 84-degree field of view diagonally, okay, across the sensor. Now, interestingly enough, if I use a Canon APS-C, like a Canon 50D as an example, in order to get the same field of view, I need a 15 millimeter, okay? So this is what happens when you start looking at shooting different skyscapes. You'll notice here that if I have a 14 millimeter on a full frame Canon camera, or Nikon or whatever, I would need an 8 millimeter with an APS-C style camera in order to have the same effective field of view. And you'll notice here as well, as I get to longer focal lengths, my exposure time to not have star trails, as you had mentioned before, goes down. So you have to be very mindful of that. And you can see here, once you start getting close to a 50 millimeter with a full frame, you're only going to have about 10 seconds or so before you start to get blurring across your sensor. So if you're wanting to do star trail photography, no problem, this doesn't apply. But for those of you that want to get a clean skyscape, you're going to have to balance this out if you're not going to track the image. So once we get larger, let's say effective focal lengths, you're definitely going to have to track, okay? Whether you have a dedicated tracking mount or piggyback it on a telescope with a tracking mount, something like that is what you're going to need in order to do those kind of shooting. And again, we'll talk about that next month. So I'm just going to highlight the 24 millimeter again. You can see here how about 21 seconds is what I have before using this 500 rule here. I mean, some people use a 600 or a 500 rule. Basically, this is just a rule of thumb. You take the focal length and divide it into 500, and that gives you the number of seconds before you start seeing pixels smear on your thing. Again, it's subject to a little bit of interpretation because as we get to finer and finer pixels, you're going to have some challenges there. But this is still fairly valid for most situations, kind of a worst case scenario. So again, if you're 20 seconds or below and you're using this type of a lens, no problem. Notice again, the Canon one, about 13 seconds is our limit. If I had an Nikon type of system, again, for the same effective focal length, it would be 14 seconds because it's just a little smaller ratio there. So just to give you an idea here what's happening, so see at 30 seconds we're already starting to get some trailing here on this full frame field of view or image. And obviously as I get to 2 minutes, you've got quite a bit of trailing. And again, if that's the effect you're shooting for, no problem. Go ahead and do that. But you can see as you go progressively down, 15 seconds is kind of, in this one, 30 seconds is exceeding 21. So we're just starting to see the onset of trailing there. All right, so again, people will ask what kind of lens is best. It depends on the kind of shooting you want to do. So if you want those wide panoramic shots or doing things like Brian does as an example, doing meteor study, you're going to want as much sky as possible because the chances of catching a meteor crossing your field of view is much better. It's like buying more lottery tickets in the lottery. You have a better chance if you buy one. So same kind of thing here. You're getting as much sky that you can get. And there's quite a few really nice lenses. Some of them aren't cheap. Like this one here is a very expensive lens, but it's an ultra-wide zoom, so you can adjust it across a range of focal lengths to kind of narrow it in a little bit or get a very wide panoramic view. You can also get some wide-angle zooms that can also do the same thing. They're very good for shooting those really large skyscapes. The what I call vista shots, or ones where they're still very wide, but they're not like this near panoramic view, would be these standard wide angles. So like the 24 millimeter as an example, is usually a good starter choice for a lot of people. And these fixed prime lenses are really nice because you've got a generous field of view and they're kind of optimized for that focal length, which is really nice. They give very, very nice performance. You can get them in like f2.8, f1.8, f1.4 sometimes, even 1.2. These little pancake lenses are also something that are often overlooked. Canon's come out with a couple, just as an example. I have both the 24 and the 40, and they're actually pretty sharp. You don't quite get the entire sharpness across the full field. I would say 90% of the field is pretty darn good, but they're much less expensive than these heavier ones. They're also a lower profile on the camera and a little lighter weight. So it makes it nice as a travel lens as well, right? You've got a little bit less lens hanging out the front of your camera. So they're worth a look, for sure. Another one for when we talked about our human vision, for those of you that did attend that talk a couple months ago, I was talking about how our cone density is in our foveal, the fovea is like within a plus or minus 25 degree range or so. That's where the bulk of our sharp vision is. Even though we see, much wider than plus or minus 25 degrees, most of our visual field, like the sharpest part of it, is in that kind of almost 50-ish degree field of view. And these lenses, typically with the cameras we've been talking about today, will give kind of that vision light shot. So that's why they're often used for portraits quite often as well. And then of course when we go to telephoto lenses, this is when we're starting to get into regime of tracking. Like a lens like this is really nice for shooting skyscapes. This f1.4 85 millimeter would be fantastic. Very expensive lens, but again, you're going to have to start tracking it because you're going to have too short of exposure. I wouldn't recommend using these types of telephoto lenses, like the 75 to 300 and 55 to 200 or whatever it might be. if you're trying to do still skyscape photography, because typically the F ratio is going to start at 4 usually. Some will go to 3.5 and then they go to 5.6. So the problem is you first of all don't have enough, it's not a fast enough lens, but also as you start to zoom out, now you're narrowing your field of view or effectively increasing your magnification on the sensor, and then you're not going to be able to expose as long in order to get sharp images untracked. Now if you have a tracking mount, if you want to piggyback it on a telescope, no problem. But I'm just emphasizing that if you have something like that, you probably will have a tough time taking crisp sky shots untracked unless you go to something more along what we've been talking about before. Now, one thing that people, and I'll talk more about this next month as well, but one thing that a lot of people are starting to, there's a trend in digital photography right now to go to what's called old glass. And this is old 35mm lenses that at the time were kind of the creme de la, or the top of the technology, like in the late 80s, early 90s. Because we're shooting manually, these things don't have to be electronic lenses. All I need is to be able to control the aperture, and everything else is controlled from the camera. You know, Zeiss, there's some really good Zeiss, Voigtlander, Leica are very expensive lenses, but I mean even some of these OM, Olympus, and Minolta lenses were actually pretty good in their day. And there's even some older Canon lenses that you could easily mate to your camera with the appropriate adapter, and you could have some really good success with them. I bought a few over the winter and I haven't had a chance to really play with them much, so I'll have to report on that another time, but hopefully the weather will perk up a little bit so I can start playing a little bit more, because I think it'll be an interesting experiment. But these, sometimes you can get it, either it could be an estate sale on Kijiji, or some of the local photo shops might recondition these, and they're in like near like new condition, even though they're used. And they're worth a look for sure, because they're a lot cheaper than, say, getting a top-of-the-line Canon L series lens that might cost you like more than your camera. So we'll kind of put a pin in on the lenses for the moment. We'll talk more about that next month. But these are some of the links that I used for this talk, and the one I want to just highlight here super quick is this one on ISO DSLR photography. I'll just blank, hang on. I just want to blank this out for a minute here so that you can see it in case those in the back can't see that little orange out thing. This one here, and I had forgotten about it, and Richard actually mentioned it on a recent post this past month. But this one here, if you're not sure what your ISO setting for your camera should be to get started, this is a good place to go. Because the guy actually has posted a lot of specs for a wide range of cameras, like Nikon, Fuji, Sony, Canon, and so on. And you've actually got, you'll be looking for a little elbow curve where you have sort of a peak in your signal to noise ratio and dynamic range, and then where the noise falls off. And that would be a good place to start for your particular camera. So again, if you're looking for a certain type of camera, or you own one now and you're not sure where to get started on, and it's your first kick at the can, this would be a good way to start. So definitely go to that site there. Finally, I'm just going to wrap up this talk by, Brian was kind enough to loan me a couple of images that he took, one with his Canon T1i, and this was down in Arizona. And you can see here, he's just on the edge of getting some sky, you know, like blurred stars here on this particular image. But the big thing I want to take away here, he's trying to capture meteor showers. So obviously he wants to be right on the edge of where he's starting to get star trails maybe, but capture one or two meteors ideally. Obviously he missed it in this one. The big thing here though is these are unprocessed images. So if you get decent skies, have decent equipment, and you know, play around a little bit, I mean, that's a pretty decent image for an unprocessed image. There's a lot of detail that can be pulled out if you start post-processing, for sure. So, and notice he said about 6400 here on that camera. On his 60D, I was actually surprised when I saw this up at 26500. It's got a little bit of noise, but it's not bad. I mean, really, it's not bad at all. There's lots of Milky Way detail in there, okay? So like I say, you know, you get a decent camera, play around a little bit with what you have, you can actually get some pretty decent shots. And Sheila's done some fantastic work for those of you that got to attend her talk a couple of months ago there at Oakhammock Marsh. That was a really neat presentation that she had. She's obviously learned how to use her camera very effectively. And again, it takes practice. It's like anything else, whether you're doing playing baseball, hockey, shooting astrophotos or whatever, you do need to practice in order to get reliable results. and it's all a learning process. So we'll leave that there for today. Thank you very much for your attention. I have time for maybe one super quick question if somebody has one, and then we'll leave it at that for today. And then you can come see me during the break if you have it. Yes, go ahead.
What's your feeling about third-party lenses like the Rokinon and the 14mm?
Sorry, my feeling on third-party lenses?
Like
such as
the
what?
Rokinon 14mm, I know a lot of people talk about that one or ask for.
Well, I haven't used the Rokinon per se, but I've heard mixed reviews as well on some of those, and actually, oh, somebody has an answer? Go ahead.
Darren, I've got that lens, very nice lens, 14 f2.8.
Is it good?
Yeah.
Okay,
Alan
so-
Dyer loves it.
Oh, and Alan Dyer loves it. Okay, there you go. So you guys can compare notes there during the break there. But I've heard good reviews on some of the Rokinons and other things, but that particular one I wasn't familiar with. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Bill. Thank you very much for that. But again, it's a good example of where you can use third-party lenses and get really good results, right? So thank you guys. Appreciate it. So just before I run away, you can't get away that quick. Where is it here? Oh, here it is. Okay. I know most of you are here from last month, but I just wanted to quickly, hang on, do I have to hit the full screen? Is it? What's going on? Sorry, guys. Okay, so this one is, I have to close this one. Are we there? Oh, okay. No, we're not. There we go. I just wanted to mention the mentorship program one more time. It's an initiative that our council has endorsed, and myself, Brian, our club president, and Bill Crosby so far. Thanks again for your involvement, Bill, and we're going to do some fun things. I had a chat with Bill last night, actually, just before, and originally what this idea here is, and I'll just kind of rifle through this really quick, but for those of you that are new members that maybe just signed on last month, the idea here is to kind of get you guys started early and get some mentorship by some of our more senior people out here to be able to do things like, you know, let's say a little bit of astrophotography and how to get started, or maybe German equatorial alignment, polar alignment, and so on, and how to use your scope and so on. That's kind of the idea here. We were going to do it in modules, but I think one thing that Bill and I talked about, and we'll have to talk to Brian about this as well, but what we're going to try and do is do it a little bit more based on the actual person that we're mentoring, because some people may be really good with one aspect that they understand already and not something else. So we'll probably just go through a checklist and make sure that the people understand what they need to know and stuff like that. But I think it's going to be a really exciting program. It'll help people who are new that maybe don't have equipment or are just in the process of using their new equipment. They can get an early start and have more fun under the sky. So again, it's myself, Brian, and Bill currently, and if anybody else would like to volunteer, even just once in a while to help mentor, I'd certainly appreciate you letting me know. The people that I'm talking about certainly know how to get hold of me, so by all means, please feel free to do so. It would be very helpful, as we get more and more new members. There'll be more on that later. In fact, I've got a little announcement that I just want to briefly mention here. This is what we're calling the binocular newbie night. I've already got 12 people confirmed of our new members that have expressed an interest, and it's tomorrow night at around 8:30 or so. We're doing, it's just between Cedar Bog Trail and, well actually this is my old one, I didn't update it, sorry guys. The location is actually between Chickadee and, I hope the map's the right one. Did I put the map in here? No, I didn't. Hang on, sorry guys, just give me a second. I'll just mention it, it's okay. The ones that I've already emailed you is fine. But basically, what we're doing is we're going to be going to Birds Hill Park, and it's between the Chickadee Trail and General Area Use Number 1 on the North Road, or the North Drive. And it's about maybe 1 or 2 kilometers in from the park gates. There's a nice field over there. So for those new members that I don't have on my list yet, and when I say new members, let's say within the last year or so, feel free, if you've got a pair of binoculars or a new scope that you want to bring out to have some fun under the sky with. I would certainly welcome that. If you have a new camera with a tripod, you want to try experimenting, shooting some stuff, Brian will be around to help mentor you as well on that. And the idea is just to have fun under the sky. I prefer this particular event to make sure that that the new folks get a chance to really get started. So if any of you new members that we haven't talked to yet, come and see me at the break, and we'll make sure we get you the information you need. So that's all I wanted to mention there. Thanks, guys.
Derek,
Yes.
just want to add to that although we discussed about the focus about being binocular observing as a good place to start, or if you've got a new scope, you want to uncertain about aspects of it, bring it along. But it really is going to be kind of like, it's tailored to what the people would like. So if someone comes on and says like, well, I don't even know how to find my way around the skies. Can you help me with some of the constellations? We'll be there. We'll have some charts.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that, Bill.
We'll help
So
everyone
even
out.
though we're talking about binoculars, yeah, we're going to do things like star hopping, whatever you guys would like to do as new members for sure. The idea is to have fun under the sky and learn your way around the sky. And we'll do a little bit of everything there, and we'll make it a lot of fun. So thanks, Bill.
As promised, tomorrow it's supposed to be up to about 9 or 10 degrees.
Yeah, and then overnight, I think it's going to be about maybe 3 or 4 below. Maybe it could be 0, I don't know yet. It's hard to say. It's the best weather we've had in a while, so we're hoping we're going to be okay on that.
All right. Anyways, I'm Brian Stash, I'm the president for the club. We have quite the lineup for today, as you can see. We'll have Jay doing the what's up, and then we have Michelle for what's new, and then our feature presentationer, is Mr. Gordon. Is he here right now? Oh, thank you. Yeah. Sorry. All right, so I'm looking forward to that. Okay, next slide. Okay, we have the open house at the University Medical. What's the date? April the 24th. Okay. What else can I say about it? It's open to everyone. I'll be there. We'll have some public. I'll mention more about my club or the club. What else can I say? Okay, of course, there is a little telescope, like 216-inch on the top of the building. Danielle is the professor that hosts it. We don't have a topic just yet, but we'll find out more about it later. What's up? Doe Comic March. This is really good because Jerry's doing this, and we'll be quite talking about telescopes. Jerry, you want to add anything to it, or?
Nope.
Nope. All right. Okay, and if you, of course, you remember, if you bring your telescope, Michelle.
Is there an email on that? Okay.
Maybe turn down the brightness a bit because you're kind of swamp.
Okay, March.
There you go.
How's that? Sorry. All right. All right. Okay, and if you bring your telescope, your fee gets waived, and of course, I think we're looking for quite a few telescopes to help out Jerry there. Next, Astronomy Day. We finally got confirmation on it. It's going to be May the 11th, going from 11 to 4. We are looking for volunteers. So, but it's mostly if you want to help out indoors, or if you have a solar scopes to lend a hand during the day, that would be great. It's only short. It's only from 11 to 4, so if you want to help out, this is at Polo Park there. If you want to help out, that would be great. Is this showing here?
No, it's in McGilvery.
Sorry?
Isn't it McGilvery?
Keniston.
Keniston is, yeah, McGilvery. Not McGilvery, it's on Route 90.
Yeah, it's the right next to Polo Park.
Is that a different place? One off Empress.
Is it where we were last
Oh,
year?
right. Oh, that one. Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Okay, I got it wrong. Okay, that was from last time. Okay, sorry. I got confused. Okay, you're right. Next, Spruce Woods. So I'm really excited about this Spruce Woods Star Party. It's going to be about 4 days long. It's on September long weekend. So it's a great way for new members to get to know some of these more senior members out there. And some of the senior members will have telescopes that are pretty spectacular. One time Ray had his 25-inch telescope. I don't think he's going to be doing that this year, but it's quite nice. So it's a great way to mingle some of the other members and see other people in a different spotlight. If you have any information or if you want to have any info, you can contact Sylvia during the break, or that's her email. I don't know if I'm allowed to use that email, but
Yep.
it's okay.
Yep.
Wasn't too sure. Okay, and unfortunately, it looks like we're going to need a park pass. Is that for sure?
Yeah, it looks like this year they don't have the free park pass like in previous times, so make sure that you get a park pass for your vehicle. Because even though you're at the Star Party, they're going to be checking for park passes.
Okay.
So you can even buy it for like, daily or for the 3 days. You don't have to buy
Or
it.
you can buy the year and pay the $45 or $35. Because I go to Boulder Park for skiing. So anyways. All right, so if you want a little bit more info, or if you went to the website would have something on there. Telescope loans. Abdul is handling the program. If you want to lend a telescope or loan a telescope to you, we're more than happy to. Usually it's for 1 month. What else can I say? We have quite a lineup of telescopes. Abdul, you're here, so if you want to see them during the break, please do. This is some of the lineup of telescopes that we do have. PST is quite nice. We do have a little tracking mount here. The Sky Adventure is quite nice. It comes with the PST. So if you want to use the PST and attach your camera to it, that'd be great. So it's up to you how you want to use it. We do have other telescopes like Glen Lee, which I'll mention after. I do have to mention this. One of the telescopes was donated to the club. Willard Elliott donated. I went to Steinbach a couple weeks ago to pick it up. I think he was a member. I'll tell you why. I'll write up a more bio on him, more information in the newsletter coming up. Of course, he was born in 1935. He was an electrical engineer. He worked for CKY and CBC. So I'll tell you more about later. He donated the Meads ETX 125, which is quite nice. It's kind of like a flip mirror there, so you can look at the eyepiece or attach a camera to it. It is a go-to. Did get a chance to go through it all to see how it works, but he was really into his telescope. And of course, he's about 84 years old, and of course, he has cancer. So haven't met the guy. I just met the power of attorney at Steinbach. So I'll write up a little bio on him and include a little more pictures. That's the telescope right there. It's not bad. It's clean. There's no scratches of any kind. There's two controllers, which I can't figure out how it works because the main one, the AutoStar doesn't plug in. So I can't figure out why. The older one does work, plugs in, but the other one doesn't. So I don't know how that works exactly, but I have to figure out. He made his own mount. It's quite sturdy, quite heavy too. But one night, maybe at Glen Lee, I'll have it out for everyone to have a look at it. Okay, this is interesting because I assume he was a member because this is the old Winnicentric for the Winnipeg division. And I'll have it scanned in and I'll post it up on the site soon. But I don't know if it's not really highlighted very good here, but I did this a little bit more. Maybe not. Went up. Down.
What year is that, Craig?
That's what I'm trying to show you guys. Okay. That's supposed to be 1989. Yeah. We have John Haynes and Paul Paradis. What's his name? And of course, my good friend Stan Romer. So he's been on council for quite a long time. So I'll have to scan in. I'll post it on the website at some point. But yeah. Anyways, all right. Glen Lee. That's me. I'm the director of Glen Lee Observatory. So if you want the warm key, come see me during the break. I'll be happy to give you one. Of course, it's open to only to the members. And because of the flooding, we're not going to have any members tonight. Of course, we're going to have it at Birdsville Park tomorrow, which is even better. What else? I'll have a little map at some point. Once we get the website up going, we'll have a map for the new members of where you can find it. And of course, I do provide training for the observatory. So I'll show you how to use the dome. I'll show you how to use the LX200. I'll show you both ways to the hand controller, and I'll show you a way you can hook up to your laptop and navigate to Skype. And happy here. All right, just kind of give you an idea about it. I'm trying to work on like a little astrophotography kit here as a guide scope. And of course, right now, Glen Lee, this has all been taken apart. just kind of say this is kind of we're working on like a new button system here that we have to guide the scope. I should have another picture that you can control it on the warm room. But I'll tell you more about that later. And of course, it's fully functional. We have a microwave oven, we have a Keurig coffee machine, we do have coffee, water, everything that you need. We have a computer there as well. Not anymore, actually, because the flooding did all disappear right now. What else can I say? Okay, so like I said, Members Night has been officially moved over to Birdsville Park. Darren will be hosting it, but I'll be there as well to help out. And is it 8:30, was it?
Yeah,
8:30? Okay.
All right. I want to come a bit earlier, that's okay, because like I said, primary focus is with the new folks, but certainly.
Well, because it'll still be a little bit of daylight. Right.
So you can get set up and ready to go.
So I'll bring up one of my other 6-inch go-to and see how it's working before the next birthday party goes. Okay, so everyone's more than welcome to join that. And why is it not? Okay, this is something I didn't have on my last slide. I'm learning how to use this OneDrive that I have. And for some reason, when I downloaded from OneDrive, I didn't get the updated version of my file I was working on. So this was back in March, or just prior to March, before our next meeting. Maybe it's an idea. As I mentioned, I did kind of a deuce of hazard on some of the snow drifts coming out here. And do not do that, because I think I ruined my car, because that is just one nose-heavy kind of car that just hit the ground really hard. So do not attempt that, that's it. I don't know if Hollywood does it, but my code escape is not means for doing anything jumping on it. As you can see, someone stopped right here, that's why I stopped, and I decided just to walk the rest of the way. There's no way, even with my snow tires and my four-wheel drive, I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to take any chances getting out there. All right, but I do have an earlier picture, which Glenlee was a couple weeks ago, but anyways. What else do we have? We have Sport Universe. Dennis is hosting this. This is really good. You want to get to know the nice guy. So we'll study some of the deep sky images, but we have to do, of course, sketching is part of the job. So we'll look at the objects, and you'll sketch it, and then, of course, after 3 or 6 months, you'll get a certificate in the end. If you want to join the program, I highly recommend it for the new members. Please contact Dennis. Dennis is here, so if you have any questions. Yep, Dennis is there, just raise his hand. Okay, all right, what else do I have? Okay, the mentor program, of course, Darren mentioned it. If you want to contact us, Darren is lead on it, in the program. Of course, you can come see us during the break to learn more about it. And this time, I have the slides to show you 6 different programs that we have currently. We're working on more programs on it. This is more geared towards the new members, to help out the new members so they have an idea about how to use their telescopes, how to use the DSLR cameras, and navigating the night sky. What else do we have? Okay, this is the list of the council members. Before I go, Sam and Darren puts this together. We have our new little badges here to identify who we are. It looks really nice, looks very official. Thank you, Sam. Darren, and it looks really nice. So this is how you can identify us during the break. And if you have any questions, please contact us or come approach us. Before I go, Dennis, you want to mention about the NCC?
Yeah. So we're going to try again out at the Nature Conservancy of Canada down at by Stewartman on April 27th. We're hosting an open public star party. And the intent there, of course, if you're not familiar with it, we're looking at dark sky preserve. And one of the steps is, holding the public events, getting them online, getting them to support it, and then we'll submit for an application for dark sky. So we're looking for volunteers to bring scopes, come down. You don't need to worry about knowing a whole lot of things, because once we go, I've got a few people that are going to do presentations. And we'll talk a little bit about dark skies and what the RASC does and working with the NCC, Nature Conservancy of Canada. And again, we'll probably we want to be there for about 7 o'clock because we're advertising it for 8. So if you're interested in going, again, you saw my email up there, dennis.lyons.3@gmail.com. Send me an email saying you're interested. I'll also send something out on RASC's email address just to remind everybody. Just let me know if you're available. And we'll also arrange to meet up at a certain place and then take you down, because if you haven't been to the site before, it can be hard to find. Once you've been there once, it's pretty easy to find. So, if you got any questions, see me at 3.
All right.
And just on that other point, for those going on the binocular tour, on Saturday, explore the universe, download it, go on out. So after we show you how to find it, go back and find it. Sketching is recommended, it's not necessary, but you may be able to already get started on some of your items to be able to work towards your recognition. All right?
Dennis, I'm way ahead of you there. I'm bringing a rollout lunar map so that you guys can kind of look for some of the crater
Yeah.
features and stuff. Even though it's only 55% illuminated or so, we'll still be able to
Yeah,
grab
so
stuff.
there's, you can combine all these things together for lots of different things. The RASC is exciting.
Okay, so next we have What's Up with Jay. One mouse here now.
Are you gonna go surfing tomorrow? Yeah. Where have you been exactly? Were you with NASA doing some kind of exploring out there?
Might explain why the wind is
Dennis has some good ideas. You were what? She has like this secret.
All right.
What? You have to keep a closer eye on Mark.
Okay, I'm going to be quick because we're a little behind on time here. So you have noticed it's April, and if you had a look at the sun, there's a sunspot on it. Quite a big one too. Judy tells me that it's visible to the eye when there was a little bit of a thin cloud today. And that sunspot is actually kind of an active looking guy. He's kicking off some extreme ultraviolet signal here. There's a flare that was reported in it yesterday. So the sun has been without sunspots on many occasions because we're very close to the bottom of the sunspot cycle. We're down in about here, so pretty close to the bottom. And this is the sort of range of predictions for the next sunspot cycle. So they're making it about the same size as the one we just left. So we should be reaching up toward maximum around 2025 or 2024. But of course the maximum just passed was not a very big one, so it didn't seem to hurt us in terms of watching aurora and things like that.
It's a total eclipse in 2024.
So just take a look at the sky condition. This isn't actually March the 8th, it's April the 11th. But And what we can see in here is the moon is up in the sky. We have the winter Milky Way off toward the west side. We have Leo, the lion with the backwards question mark. We have Virgo coming up in the sky, Gemini and Cancer more or less overhead. And up above the usual Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, Cepheus, if you want to look toward the north. So that'll give you what the evening conditions are like. You switch over into the morning. By now the winter Milky Way is set. There's bits of it up here, and the summer Milky Way is starting to appear. I still got the wrong month on this. And, we can see now that the constellation Virgo has moved over into this part of the sky. Here it is here. Libra is following now, and Leo is up in here setting off in the west. And the brightest part of the Milky Way here in Sagittarius is now actually reasonably close to the south and fairly well placed, except that at this time in the morning it's starting to get pretty light out. You probably want to sit around and wait until September when it's out in the evening sky and watch it then. Go a month ahead into May. This time I got the month right. And you can see that in the evening in May, which is when we'll have our next meeting, that we mostly have Leo and Virgo. And not too much of a, it's moving farther along, higher up in the sky. Virgo was down in here earlier. But we're also now an hour later because it's still light out at 10 o'clock. And now here in the evening, we're starting to see the summer Milky Way rising up. And then when we get into 4 a.m., again earlier than the last one, summer Milky Way. So what happens between morning or night, evening and morning is equivalent to about a month's worth of movement of the Earth around its orbit in the position of the stars. Wanted to talk a little bit about the sunset sky. The only thing we've got out in the sunset is Mars here, and it's been there for quite a while. It's in retrograde motion, which means it's moving back this way, so that as the sky itself starts to sink into the sunset over the next months, Mars itself will be moving backwards, and so it'll hold its position approximately the same point in the sky. It's not very well positioned, but it is there, one of the brighter things, and the only planet in the evening sky. Looking at the morning sky, you can see we have two planets, Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter's low down. This is the ecliptic, which is the path that the planets follow. And the ecliptic is very low, but wait 11 years, I think we'll be fine. And then Jupiter will be up high in the evening. So if you want to see Jupiter, it's certainly bright enough. Saturn isn't too bad, and probably doesn't stand out as well as it does on this chart. And of course, Jupiter's in the middle of the summer Milky Way at 4 a.m. There are also some other planets in the morning at 4 a.m. Here we are looking at sunset in May. Mars is lower down, but it's still there a month later. And again, I'm at 11 p.m., so Mars at 10 p.m. will be up in here, pretty close to where it was. And this night that I'm showing you is a fairly bright moon moving through Leo. So Mars is still there as a planet. We get a movement here. And then here we are, May 13, morning sky at 4 a.m. Saturn, Jupiter, and I'm not showing them because at 4 a.m. they're not up, but we'll cover that off in a minute. One of the things I wanted to point out in the constellation Virgo, and I've lost my pointer here, Virgo is what's called the realm of the galaxies. So this is just a mapping of some of the galaxies that are there. There's many, many more than that. They're mostly showing just the Messier catalog objects. But you don't even have to know where these things are. You just have to point the telescope up close to Vindhyatrix here, the star up above me, and just point the telescope in the general area and you'll come across hundreds of galaxies. You might be able to do that tonight if somebody's got a small telescope. Planets, the moon is at its most northerly position tonight, so it's obstructing the sky about as much as it possibly can. It'll give you a problem tomorrow. Mercury is in the morning sky. It's well west of the sun, but because the ecliptic is so low, it doesn't actually come very high above the horizon. Venus is also down there, close to Mercury, and Mars, we've already seen where that is right now. And it'll start to get into the highlight in May. Jupiter, we've also seen where that is, rising at 11:40 now, but in a month it'll be, or say at 1:40, I think it'll rise, it'll be before midnight in a month. Saturn, similarly, Uranus is in the sun and will stay there for the next month, just barely moving out in time for May. And Neptune is coming out from behind the sun, but once again, it's low on that ecliptic, so probably wouldn't find it very visible. We haven't got too much to watch for. April 23rd in the morning, the moon is above Jupiter. You can see that image in the left-hand side there. So it'll be a bright planet close to the gibbous moon. And then when you get to the 25th in the morning, the moon's just under Saturn. So Jupiter and Saturn are 2 days movement of the moon apart. And then you get a Mercury and Venus in close approach on April the 16th, but very low in the sky. We have one decent meteor shower, the Lyrids, that are going to peak on the 23rd, but they range for about a week centered on that. 18 per hour, the zenith hourly rate, which is a sort of theoretical rate that a person that could see the entire sky and dark sky would see. So you could usually count about half of that. They're not particularly bright, but it is known to have some pretty good fireballs. Just in case you're feeling encouraged to go out, here's the next 10 days of cloud and temperature. You can see that the computer model is saying that on the 20th and 21st we're going to reach above 20 degrees. This will be the third time this month it said we're going to do that. And you can see though that it's showing tomorrow evening is pretty low on the cloud cover, so you should be lucky. And just to keep things honest, snow followed by rain on Monday, and just to let you remind you that it's still not out of winter. And here's Gail's cat picture. Thank you very much.
I assume people know what happened this week. A lot of people. So we've actually managed to take the first image of a black hole. Well, actually, it's the shadow cast of a black hole. And this is the Event Horizon. It was taken by the Event Horizon telescope, and it was a press release April 10th, 9 a.m. Eastern. And a bunch of us in the physics department were watching this and having coffee and donuts. And it's a black hole located at the center of M87 cluster, so 54 million light years away. I can't remember how many minutes it takes light to go from this Earth, sun to the Earth. 8 minutes, so that gives you an idea. That's 54 million years for light to get to us. So that's, you see that kind of I'm not sure everyone knows what a black hole is, so I'm going to give an explanation. It's based on the theory of general relativity, so I guess I kind of maybe have to do that first. So, some of you may recognize this slide. It's just a very naive way of looking at it. It's an oversimplified view, but basically imagine a rubber sheet and you put a giant ball in the middle. And in fact, you can go to YouTube and find this fascinating video where they put a bowling ball on a sheet and then they roll this tiny mass around that goes in orbit around it. So, and then if you really have a really good imagination, you can try to imagine a rubber sheet in higher dimensions. So basically the idea is that the sheet represents the deformation in space-time due to the mass that's here. And Einstein's theory of general relativity is a geometric description of the deformation of space. One side of the equation, the other side is related to the mass energy or something like that. So it's kind of a weird EMC squared thing, much more complex. So is there any truth to this theory? Well, 1919, there was an editing expedition, and basically what they did was they knew there was going to be an eclipse, and they knew there was going to be a star behind it after months of observing, and if Einstein's theory of general relativity is correct, it would show the light bending around the sun, and so you would see this is the path of light, but when you look at it, it would appear to come from here because it's bent. Just like you see ships over the horizon due to atmospheric effects. So, okay, what other things are there? Well, there's this phenomenon called gravitational lensing. And here we have an observer, and here we have an object, some massive object, and the light gets bent around it, and then you can look, when you look, you see backwards. And it's not like a typical lens. It's more like the bottom of a wine glass you can actually use as a simulation. And so you get this ring structure imitating something down there. Here's the things that are smiling. So, okay, so you have a sense of general relativity. What is a black hole? Well, it's something so massive that if something ends up in there, it doesn't come out. And the way I like to describe the event horizon, you can imagine if a beam of light came across here, it would get really, really bent, and then even more bent as you get closer, and then eventually it would end up in a circle. And beyond that would fall in and no return. So this singularity, or the event horizon, is the point of no return. And so we basically looked at a photo of this. So what's the big deal? This is yet another test of Einstein's theory of general relativity. I only quoted a couple of tests here off the top of my head that I know of. There's others. Actually, there's some more I know, but the bending of light around stars, time dilation. Actually, that's interesting. That was done, I think, around World War II. They actually took an aircraft in a harbor, I can't remember where, took 2 atomic clocks, synced them, then one flew into harbor for many, many hours and came back down and found the time dilation difference. Precession of Mercury's orbit, that was an interesting thing that happened way back when. So Mercury does this, but it sort of spirals like a spiral graph as it goes around, so that's called precession. And it could not be explained by Newtonian mechanics. It was only general relativity that was able to predict that precession rate because it's so close to the sun. It's a gravitational lensing I talked about. Gravitational waves, LIGO, if you remember, that was a really good event too, the first time we saw gravitational waves. So here we've taken an image of the event horizon. Now, what you're actually seeing here, this isn't a radio, and you're seeing a radio image, and what's happening is that because in the radio, you have an accretion disk, and so you have a black hole, and all this matter is being swept in, it's giving off light and all this radiation, but it's hard for most light to punch through that, but the radio waves make it through, and you start to see that image. Jan, our guest speaker, is going to speak about that a bit more, so about accretion disk and so forth. So I'm just mentioning it here. And in the back, there's sort of a diagram showing the shadow cast. So Einstein's theory of general relativity predicts a certain shape to this, and that's what they've observed here. Just as a side note, they've also imaged Sagittarius A star, but they're still processing it, so that'll take some time. So how'd they do that? Well, what they did was they have a network of radio telescopes across the globe, and because of that, you have an effective dish that's the size of the planet. And also, as you add more telescopes, you get better resolution, or as the Earth spins, you also start filling in this Earth-sized lens, and then you process it. The other interesting thing about this is that the data is so large, like you're talking petabytes of data, that you have to transport it by plane. You can't use internet. So they take all this data, transport it, and process it, and that's how they get that image. So it's a lot of processing. Okay, so what else is new? This was also something that happened recently this month. We have a person in the department called J.M. English, and she put together this image, which is a composite image of infrared and radio. And I think everyone knows what a supernova remnant is, but basically it's left over from an exploding star. If the star is massive enough, it produces a very dense object, compact object called a neutron star, which is about the size of our planet. And you could just say it's a giant nucleus of an atom. But what's interesting about this one is that when it exploded, there must have been gas or something here, and it actually shot back the neutron stars right down here. It got pushed back, and so you get this weird object. And that's just sort of a theory, because they're still trying to figure it out, but that's a theory. So it's interesting, because this was in the news. Actually, there's a radio show called What's Up to Speed, CBC. So this month, I was on it for the planetarium show. Jan was on it, and then one of the professors, Chris O'Day, was also on it, our supervisor. So yeah, we've been on the air all month. Okay, so finally, oh, wow, that was nice. Someone get me back. Oh, you went the wrong way. Yeah. No, it's fine. Yeah, and of course my favorite subject. Don't worry, I'll stop talking about it in 2020 when the last images come in. This is the latest video. It's a flyby, so you can see like stars and apparently other Kuiper belt objects. And you'll see it fly in, so you can see it's focused on Ultima Thule, and then you'll see it fly by and then recede. And it's a composite of images and stuff that they've put together. So it's pretty cool. So scientists are learning a lot more about the solar system evolution from this. The interesting thing is they presume it was separated and somehow it mushed together softly as a contact binary. And they're not sure exactly how, so they're trying to work that out. They've discovered surface evidence of methanol, water ice, and so forth. And surprisingly, New Horizons is still gathering data. It's looking at Kuiper belt objects, or I guess in this environment, charged particle radiation and dust environment, which I guess the charged particle radiation is carrying on the tradition of Voyager and stuff that are also going out into the heliosphere and stuff like that, and looking outside our solar system.
Which Brian May is that?
Sorry?
Brian May is one of the authors.
Where are you looking?
It's not Brian May.
Where?
It's not that one?
The guitarist in Queen.
Sorry?
It's the guitarist in Queen.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
Brian May of Queen.
Okay, I don't know. Okay, so for the next slide, you should have picked up your
do a short reset, like I said, and we'll be back at 9 o'clock. Probably time dilation back at 9 o'clock. So then we'll have our feature presentation. Thank you.
About to speak today. So I'm Jan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the University of Manitoba, and my own area of research is the evolution of galaxies. So,
Well, that would help, too.
how's that?
And the lights.
Lights.
Yeah. Excellent. And the rest of this talk will probably be just as constructed, so we won't. So yeah, my area of research is how galaxies grow and evolve over time, and I have a particular interest in how the black holes at the centres of these galaxies grow and how that's influenced by the environment of the galaxy. So what I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about is just sort of a general overview of extragalactic astronomy. I've not tried this talk in this format before, so this could underrun drastically or overrun drastically. But there are some slides that anybody who was at the University of Manitoba Open House a couple of months back may recognise. I like to recycle. So, extragalactic astronomy. Now, we probably all think of this as being the purview of the telescopic era. In fact, we could actually see galaxies, and I think most people who may be aware of this, could see galaxies throughout human history with the naked eye. There are a few bright examples in the sky. The most obvious one is obviously the Milky Way. Now, the Magellanic Clouds for those in the southern hemisphere. In the north, the Andromeda Galaxy and, to a lesser extent, the Triangular Galaxy are also visible to the naked eye. Now, naturally, we didn't really know what these were until recent decades, but we could still see them. And these were recorded in ancient civilizations. For instance, the Aboriginals in Australia, there's recordings of their knowledge of the Magellanic Clouds. And certainly the Greeks knew about the Milky Way. But it's only really when the telescopic era begins, in the 17th century, that we start to notice there are more of these faint fuzzy clouds in the sky. Now, in particular, most of you will probably be familiar with Charles Messier. He was a comet hunter from France. He basically wanted to avoid anything that wasn't a comet. And through a cheap modern telescope, or a fairly good quality but poorly built older telescope, these are going to look these galaxies are going to look very similar to comets in the fact that they're just faint fuzzy patches in the sky. So he went through and he catalogued these faint fuzzies. He actually counted about 101, but it's been upgraded to 110 posthumously of these objects in his catalogue. These are the brighter ones that we know of in the sky, and about a third of them are actually now known to be extragalactic in nature, which, when you take into account that these are the brighter faint fuzzies that you see, sort of indicates that perhaps there are a large number of these objects once you start going to fainter and fainter magnitude. A few decades later, John William Herschel. That should be William Herschel on there. That's a mistake on the slide. But John Herschel was related and was involved in this, but the picture is of William Herschel, who's more famous for his discovery of Uranus, but he also conducted a sky survey, one of the first real in-depth sky surveys that was a more structured format. Carolyn and John Herschel built on this, and then eventually John Dreyer built this into the new general catalogue, which, again, I suspect a fair few people in this room are familiar with. There are nearly 8,000 objects in the new general catalogue, of which 6,000 are known to be extragalactic in nature. Now, once you're going down to the fainter magnitudes that you require these bigger telescopes to get to, you're starting to find that the majority of these fuzzy objects are extragalactic. That's again telling you a little bit that there are a lot of these objects out there. He proceed into the 19th century, you start to get some really large telescopes. In particular, Lord Ross in Ireland, he built a massive, I believe it was 72-inch telescope, and he sketched what he saw, and one of the brighter objects he looked at, M51, the famous Whirlpool galaxy, he sketched that and saw the spiral structure in that. Now, what I like about his sketch of this is when you look at the Hubble image, it's pretty damn comparable, I think. And this sort of spiral structure, I mean, this is not a sort of random structure. Clearly, it indicates some physics at work. It's not just a featureless patch of sky at this stage anymore. And as you proceed through the 19th century, more and more of these objects are seen to be these spiral nebulae, these spiral clouds. Now, the early 20th century, there was a lot of scientific debate over the nature of these spiral nebulae. Whether these were actually part of the Milky Way, or whether these were beyond the Milky Way. Now, one method of determining distance in astronomy is using a type of star called a Cepheid variable. Now, it was known that these variable stars, the intrinsic brightness of the star was proportional to the amount of time it took for the variance in that star's period. Now, if you know the intrinsic brightness of something, you can work out how far away it is. This is just a simple relation of what we call an inverse square law. Light fades to the square of the distance of the observer away from the object. So, for instance, if you've got a light bulb and you're standing 100 metres away from it, and it's at a certain brightness, if you go to 200 metres, it won't be half as bright, it'll be a quarter as bright. Now, the same thing's true for stars. If you double the distance, it'll be a quarter as faint. So you can work out the distance to something using this method. And because you've got this relationship between the variability period and the luminosity, the intrinsic brightness, all you need is the rate of variation. So Edwin Hubble, who I believe people will probably know of from his famous telescope, he looked at the Cepheid variables in the Andromeda Nebula, one of the brightest of these spiral nebulae. And he noted that the implied distance to this spiral nebula was much, much greater than the believed size of the Milky Way at the time. And the Milky Way at the time was believed to be the entire universe. And the follow-on from this is that if these are beyond the Milky Way, then the Milky Way can't be particularly special. It's one of many objects. And actually, this theory had been postulated a few years prior, in particular by Heber Curtis, and this sort of lent evidence to that for the first time. And this is sort of when we get the real birth of extragalactic astronomy. And applying the same method to various faint fuzzies in the sky, Hubble noted that not all of them were spiral in nature. You had different shapes of these galaxies, these extragalactic objects, which we now know as galaxies. And he started classifying them just on the basis of their shape. So you end up getting catalogues of different shaped galaxies. And this will become a little bit more important later on, because the shape of a galaxy can tell you a little bit about how it's evolved over the past many giga-years of its life. Giga-years being a billion years. Now, things are a little bit more interesting when you start splitting the light up into its spectrum. So if you use a prism on a beam of light, you can split it up into a rainbow. Now, in atomic physics, the atoms there are elemental transitions, there are electron transitions So you've got an atom, it's a nucleus surrounded by electrons. Now the energy of those electrons varies. If you were to throw some energy at that atom, then the energy state, that we call it, of the atom, of the electron changes. Now the changes are determined by quantum physics to be a precise energy packet. And energy relates to a wavelength, which is, or a particular colour of light. And because this is precisely determined by quantum physics, this gives you a fingerprint or a particular specific wavelength for some particular transition, or basically a fingerprint of each element, if you like. Now, if you know what that specific fingerprint looks like, then you can use that as a template to see what's going on with your light. Now, for instance, if you've got, let's take hydrogen alpha. Hydrogen alpha is an atomic transition in hydrogen. Most people will be familiar with it because it's a particularly red colour. But if you know exactly where that is, and you look at a spectrum and see that that's actually not where you expect it to be, that tells you something about that object. And what it tells you is that the light is moving away from you for some reason. Now this is the same effect as the Doppler effect in sound. If you've got an ambulance coming down the street, you hear it high-pitched. If it starts moving away, it starts sounding low-pitched. That's because each sound wave is at a slightly higher distance away from you as it moves away. The same thing happens in light. And we call this a redshift. And you can measure this redshift quite easily. And what we found, and what Edwin Hubble found, was that the further away a galaxy was, the higher this redshift, the more stretched the light was becoming. Now, this didn't matter which way you looked in the sky. You could look east, you could look west, you could look towards the Milky Way, well, you could look through the Milky Way, sort of. You could look completely away from the plane of the Milky Way. It doesn't matter. And what that tells you is that every galaxy is moving away from us as an observer. And this implies that the universe itself is expanding, the space between galaxies, that is. And this had been predicted by a Belgian astronomer, well, mathematician actually, Georges Lemaitre, a few years prior, but is named after Hubble because he discovered it. And Georges Lemaitre doesn't really get the credit for this that he really deserves, but that's sort of changing. It's becoming a bit more high profile now, but if you Wikipedia anybody after this, Wikipedia is Georges Lemaitre. Now, this expanding universe theory, this caused a little bit of a split in astronomy. There were people who thought, okay, if the universe is all expanding, what if you start winding back time? Then everything's getting closer and closer together. If you've got a lot of matter in a small confined place, things get hot. So this implied that the universe was at one point in time, if you wind back the clock far enough, both infinitesimally small and infinitesimally hot. Now this seems also to imply that, hang on, there must have been a beginning of the universe. And this didn't really sit well with a lot of astronomers, including Albert Einstein, who had a fairly high profile at this time. Now, this was known as the Big Bang model. The counter to this was called the steady state theory. This just implied that whilst the universe was expanding, there was no initial hot, condensed beginning. What happened instead was that the universe kept expanding and galaxies formed, possibly by magic. I'm not really sure what the logic was here. Galaxies just spontaneously formed to fill the voids. And this was a generally fairly well accepted theory, actually. Steady state. In fact, whilst the Big Bang theory had proponents such as Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking, Stephen Hawking's PhD advisor, Dennis Sharma, he was actually a big fan of the steady state model. And then actually his students' work went no turning, which might have been a little bit embarrassing, I'm not sure. But anyway, how do you fix this problem? You've got this divide. So if you've got this, one of the points of the Big Bang Theory was that if you've got this infinitesimally hot, infinitesimally dense initial point of the universe, then because it's infinitesimally hot, you're going to get some radiation. And despite the billions of years that have passed since then, whilst that would have been cooling down, there should still be some afterglow of that hot, dense moment of the universe. And up until the mid-60s, there was no evidence for this. However, a couple of radio astronomers in the States started noticing when they were surveying the sky that they always had this background hiss on their radio observations. Now, they actually at first thought this was perhaps the city of New York. So they pointed in a different direction, it still wasn't there. They then found what they referred to as white dielectric material on their radio telescope, which turned out to be the leavings of a pair of pigeons. This story does not end well for pigeons. Because they need to get rid of this potential source of this background hiss, and they think that perhaps this white dielectric material on the radio telescope is possibly contributing to that, it basically ends up that they end up shooting the pigeons, which is a little bit sad for the pigeons, I'm afraid. But, and it's doubly sad because it didn't get rid of the hiss. And actually, it turns out that this hiss was real. And actually, we now know it's the cosmic microwave background radiation. Basically, that since the Big Bang, the universe has been cooling as it's been expanding, but there's this background radiation that's keeping the universe at about 3 Kelvin, which is about 3 degrees Celsius above absolute zero. This actually ended up, well, firstly, and most importantly, this settled the Big Bang versus steady state theory. You've got this smoking gun for the Big Bang. You've got this hard evidence to suggest this theory is maybe not just a theory. But it also ended up winning these two pigeon killers the Nobel Prize for Physics. So, you've got this sort of picture where you've got galaxies in the sky. You know the universe is, well, we now know to be 13.8 billion years old. You know the universe had a beginning. You know it's expanding. This sort of brings us into the realm of modern extragalactic astronomy. Now, there are a couple of ways we do modern extragalactic astronomy. We don't generally just look through a single telescope these days and point at an object for however long and study a single object. We do that to an extent, but only on specific objects. In combination with the more detailed single object studies, we also do what are called wide surveys. This means you're looking at hundreds of thousands of objects at a time in order to understand particular populations and subpopulations. Also, we don't just look at galaxies in the optical. We don't just look through an optical telescope. As I mentioned a minute ago, we've got radio astronomy, but also we look at these galaxies across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So from the gamma and X-rays right through to the radio. And I'll go on to those in a bit. But let's start with the single object in-depth studies, or how detailed we can look at these objects. Now, this is a photo of the Andromeda Galaxy produced a couple of years ago by the Hubble Space Telescope. I strongly advise everybody, if they've not looked at this photo already, just to Google biggest photo ever. It's 1.5 billion pixels. But what's really cool about this is you're looking at about a third of the Andromeda Galaxy, but you can zoom in and you can see individual stars, you can see individual star clusters. There are 100 million stars in this particular image, but I mean, this is just a quick zoom in of one particular area, and you can see there's this little star cluster down here that's very much like the Pleiades in our own Milky Way, and we're seeing that kind of detail in a galaxy that's 2.5 billion light years away. I think that's pretty cool. But also, we can go a bit better than that. I mentioned that if you break down light, you can look at its spectrum, you can pick out particular features in that. Now, one of the things that we like to do these days is look at the entire galaxy we're observing. Now, if you were to look at just the galaxy as a whole, it might give you one interesting picture. But what's to say what's happening in, say, the arms of a spiral galaxy is the same as what's happening in the central bulge? Let's take the example of star formation. Now, star formation can be proxied by the hydrogen alpha line in the spectrum. That's his fingerprint of hydrogen alpha transition. Now, if you were to look at a single spectrum of an entire galaxy and you saw it had hydrogen alpha in, for instance, this particular line, this particular spectral line, you could say, okay, this galaxy is forming stars. Now, what if you were to look at different parts of that galaxy simultaneously? You could then say where in that galaxy those stars are forming. Now, what I've got up here is what we call an integral field unit spectrograph. You don't need to know the name because it means nothing to me either. But what you can see on the left-hand side is you've got a nice, pretty spiral galaxy. I don't know how far away that one is off the top of my head, but you've got this fairly nice, pretty spiral galaxy. And where that pink box is, they've stuck one of these instruments that takes a spectrum from different parts of the galaxy. Now, on the right, what you've got is the relative intensity of that hydrogen alpha line, that tracer of star formation. And where it's dark blue, there's very little star formation going on. And where it's getting lighter blue, there's more star formation. Where it's getting green and orange and then red, there's a lot more star formation going on. And you can see that there's a lot of star formation going on in that bottom left corner of that galaxy, well, on the left on that orientation, sort of bottom on the left-hand picture. You can see that there's a lot of star formation going in one particular region, sort of in the outer spiral arms. And you can also see that as you get towards the centre of that galaxy, there's a lot less star formation. And actually, this has been telling us a little bit about how star formation stops in galaxies. So I'll get onto this a little bit when I talk about quasars later. But what we're seeing here is that star formation stops in the centre of a galaxy before it stops at the outer parts of the galaxy. That's not true for all galaxies, but that is true for some galaxies. And it is certainly true for this galaxy. And that can sort of lead to questions of, okay, why is it stopping in the centre, but still going on out in the outer parts of the galaxy? And I'll provide an answer to that a bit later on, but just something to potentially think about for now. Beyond looking at individual galaxies, though, we can also map the universe, as it were. I mentioned earlier that if you've got this spectrum of light, you can take a redshift. You can see how fast that galaxy is moving away from you. Now, Hubble noted the correlation between the galaxy's distance and its redshift. So you can use redshift as a distance measure as well. So if you've got these, so if you take a spectrum of a galaxy, and you can basically find out its distance very easily. Now, with a lot of these large surveys, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of objects. In fact, millions of objects if you were to take probably the most high-profile survey, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. You're getting distance measurements as well as positional measurements on the sky for hundreds of thousands to millions of galaxies. And what we've got here is basically a slice through the sky. If you're looking down, imagine you're looking down on top of a globe. And you take a thin slice around, say, the equator, and then the coordinates along the outside, the different points around the clock, as it were, are basically right ascension. So how far east or west something is. And you can see these galaxies don't just fall randomly in space. There's definite structure there. And I hope that's clear on there, but you can sort of see you get over-dense regions where there are lots of galaxies. Each point, by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, each point on these plots is an individual galaxy. So I hope you can see that there are areas where these galaxies cluster together, you get over-dense regions, and there are also areas where there are very few galaxies. And this means that different galaxies have different environments for a start. And the environment of a galaxy can affect the way that galaxy evolves. For instance, if you imagine that a galaxy is in an over-dense region of the sky, or an over-dense region of space, it's got more galactic neighbours, it's more likely to merge with one of those neighbours, for instance. You may well have all heard that the Milky Way is going to merge with Andromeda in like 4 billion years. If you've got more and more galaxies there, there's more likelihood of something like that happening. And interestingly, the red on here are simulations and the simulated predictions, and the blue and the purple are observations, and they match pretty damn well, I think. Now, mentioning the environment, let's talk a little bit about these overdense regions, these galaxy clusters. Now, somebody mentioned earlier about there's this cluster in Virgo. Incidentally, for those familiar with the black hole news, that particular black hole was in Virgo. But in galaxy clusters, because you've got a lot of galaxies flying around at very high speeds, hundreds of kilometers per second, you get a lot of friction, and you get a lot of gas stripped off these galaxies as well. And that gives you a medium which these galaxies can fly through, as it were. And that, because of the friction, actually gets very, very hot. You're talking in millions of degrees Celsius, so hotter than the surface of the sun, which is sort of counterintuitive when you think that space is cold. But what happens when you heat a gas? If you heat the air, what happens? It rises. And that's because that gas has energy that's been provided to it and can fight against gravity. The same thing happens in galaxy clusters. So if you've got this gas that's been heated up and very hot, it's less likely to fall onto these galaxies through gravity very quickly, or fall back onto these galaxies from which it's been stripped originally. Now that has implications in the fact that once a galaxy uses up the cold gas it has for star formation, it's very hard for it to get new gas into that galaxy just through gravitational potential, because the gas in the cluster has just got too much energy to fall on. So when you get into the dense regions of galaxy clusters, you tend to find that star forming in galaxies drops off. You form fewer stars. Also, and you can see this on the right-hand side, when a galaxy is falling into a cluster, so they don't all start in clusters, because these clusters are big potentials, galaxies that aren't already in clusters will fall into these over time just through gravity. Now, as a galaxy falls in, it experiences pressure from the hot, what we call the intercluster medium, this hot gas. As it falls in, that provides a pressure for which it falls through. Now, this results in this galaxy being stripped of gas as it falls into the cluster. And you can see this on the right-hand picture. These form what are now being called jellyfish galaxies. And I think it's fairly obvious as to why. But interestingly, as they're being stripped of this gas, some of this gas falls behind the galaxy, and through turbulence, you get clouds form that are fairly compact and can form stars themselves. So you get, and I don't know if you can really see this on the slide, but just behind the main galaxy there is some bright blue blobs before the main tail. Those are areas of star forming outside the galaxy, just being dragged behind it. So this is something that's a key impact of the environment of a galaxy. Now, beyond just looking at the environment and looking at galaxies in depth, we can look very, very deep into the cosmos these days. So, one of the famous Hubble images, the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, there are 10,000 galaxies in that image, apparently. I knew it was several thousand. Basically, everything in that image, bar the moon for comparison, by the way, is a galaxy. Unless it's got diffraction spikes around it, those are stars, and I can count one. Or two. Everything else is a galaxy. Now, some of these galaxies are very, very high, what we call very, very high redshift galaxies. They're very, very far away. And because they're very, very far away, and light moves at a finite speed, that means you're also looking back a long, long time into the universe's history. And in fact, some of these galaxies that we see in this image are from a time when the universe was less than 1 billion years old. Now, the universe currently is 13.8 billion years old. So, a very, very small fraction of the universe's current age. These are some of the youngest galaxies we can observe. From a point that, beyond looking at the cosmic microwave background, is probably as early as we can see for the foreseeable future. Interestingly, this is a very, very narrow field of view. As you can see, if you look at the moon on the lower left side, you can see there's a little red square next to it for comparison. Now, the moon is 30 arc minutes across. That square is about 2.5 arc minutes across. And it took 11 days, well, it actually took a year to do this image, or to obtain all the frames for this image, but the total observation time in the stacked frame that produces it, stacked frames that produce this, is 11 days worth of observations. If you were to do the entire sky for that, to that depth, with the Hubble Space Telescope, you're looking at around 800,000 years. I think. I did that calculation on the back of an envelope earlier, so it might be wrong. Now, I also mentioned we do multi-wavelength astronomy. This is, we look at the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Now, let's take an example galaxy. This is Messier 82. It's a fairly famous galaxy, probably known as a cigar galaxy to a lot of people. And this is actually a good example of what we call starburst galaxies, going through a rapid phase of star formation. And also, you can see a little bit in this image, you can just see some green sort of offshoots from the galaxy there. That's actually matter being ejected from the galaxy as a result of supernova explosions at a high rate because of the high star formation. High star formation rate. Now, this is an optical image. If you were to take the spectrum of that galaxy, looking in that red circle, this is what you see on the, as if you break up that light from that red circle, from within that red circle. And you can see this is sort of flat line with a few lines sticking out of it. That big line that you see on the right side, that is the hydrogen alpha line. That's one of the reasons you know there's a little star formation going on. And that's sort of an optical view of that galaxy. What about the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum? Does that buy you? So if you were to look at the galaxy in X-rays, same galaxy, looks completely different for a star. But this showed that X-ray observations are sensitive to very high temperatures. And what you see is you see very, very hot plasma of your hundreds of thousands to millions of Kelvin, or degrees Celsius. Kelvin and degrees Celsius are basically the same, minus about 200. So when you're at the millions order, it doesn't really matter. The other thing that X-rays are very good at detecting is radiation from matter falling onto a very compact object, such as a black hole or a neutron star. You may have heard of something called an X-ray binary. These are stars where there's an orbiting neutron star or black hole, and what you're detecting there in the X-ray is the matter falling onto that compact object. You can also look at this galaxy in the UV, and you can start to look very much like a seagull in this particular image, but it's starting to regain a little bit of the shape that you see in the optical. And you can see ionized gas as a result of, well, you can see gas that's been ionized by young stars in the UV. This is very hot stuff. Not as hot as what you see in the X-ray. But also UV observations can help determine the chemistry of a galaxy. Now, chemistry can be influenced by stellar populations, basically elements are created in stars, but more heavier elements are created in supernova, and then those elements are then fed into the gas that forms later generations of stars. And that can impact the more complex chemistry that evolves with a galaxy. So UV can help you on that front a little bit. Skipping the optical, because I've mentioned the optical already, we'll go to the infrared. Infrared deals with cooler objects than optical. Rule of thumb, as things get colder, the wavelength gets longer. So infrared can deal with cooler stars, so for instance, brown dwarfs within our galaxy. Also reflected light off colder bodies such as planets and near-Earth objects, for instance, in the local solar system, really. Also, dust that's been heated by radiation and then re-emits that thermally. So if you heat up dust, it's then going to cool down by re-radiating that energy. That can be detected in infrared. So you can find out how dusty the galaxy is, and by dust we mean basically grains of silicate, sand effectively. And also complex molecules such as PAHs, which are polycyclic. No, I can't remember what that stands for. These are complex molecules. They're a type of hydrocarbon. I know what the H stands for. I didn't do well in chemistry at school. It shows. But these are complex molecules that are often considered to be potential precursors to life. So if you've got PAHs, you have the potential for life to develop in that region of the universe. Potentially is the key word there. Now zooming in a little bit, I didn't put the lines in to demonstrate this, but this sort of bottom one here is a radio image, but it's that very bright centre of the image above. So the orange is radio. Now in this particular instance, this is detecting the radiation from shocked gas. And that gas has been shocked by supernova explosions, and lots of them in this case. Another potential method or mechanism to produce radio waves in astronomy is the production of a jet around a compact object, such as a black hole. The interesting thing is we don't actually know how those jets are formed, but we know they are formed. Now let me get on to something that is a topic close to my heart. That is not a real life photo, I have to make that clear these days. That is an artist's impression. I'm going to talk a little bit here about supermassive black holes. Now, these reside at the centre of every massive galaxy. There are one or two lower mass galaxies where we're not sure this is the case, or we haven't found direct evidence, and this sort of throws a little bit of a spanner in the works. But it's very likely that they still probably do, even though we can't detect them. One example, interestingly, is the Triangulum galaxy M33, which is in the local group of galaxies and about 3 to 3.5 million light years away, I think. So a similar distance to the Milky Way. Now, in the most massive galaxies, the supermassive black hole at the centre of the galaxy can make up to 1/1000th of the total mass of that galaxy. Sorry, the total stellar mass of the galaxy. I'm not counting dark matter here, which I will get onto in a little while. Now, that may not seem like a big number, but take, for instance, the typical galaxy has a mass of around 100 billion suns. Then you've got a single object that's 0.1% of that entire mass. I think, given that those galaxies are made up of hundreds of billions of stars and have a mass of around 100 billion suns, the fact that one single object can take up such a high fraction of that mass, I think is pretty impressive. But these supermassive black holes are important for, well, one real reason. I can go to a real life photo now. So one real reason is, as matter falls onto these black holes, it heats up and it radiates a lot of energy. It radiates in the UV, radiating the X-rays, and the intensity of that radiation is high. And that can spread out throughout the galaxy, and that can heat up the galaxy. Now, to form stars within the galaxy, you need gas to cool, and as it cools, it condenses onto itself, and it becomes a massive object before eventually fusing elements and becoming a star. If you're heating up the gas, it becomes a lot harder for stars to form. And if you remember, I'll scroll back to it. If you remember this little pot here, the star forming in this galaxy has stopped or is stopping at the centre of the galaxy before it's stopping further out. Now, if, for instance, you've got matter accreting onto a supermassive black hole and it's heating up a galaxy, it's going to heat up the inner region of that galaxy first, and as the radiation travels out, remember that the speed of light is finite, and these galaxies are hundreds of thousands of light years across, effectively. So it's going to take time for that radiation to travel, and then time for the knock-on effects to prevent the star forming, etc. You're going to stop star formation in the centre first. So these supermassive black holes can explain that inside-out suppression of star forming that we see in some galaxies. Now, these actively feeding black holes are known, probably the most high-profile name is a quasar. Now, they're known as quasars originally because they were a class of objects found in the 50s that were detected in the radio. They were detected because of these jets that are detectable in the radio that I mentioned a minute ago. But when they were looking to see what that region of sky looked like in the optical, all they could find was a star. Then when they took spectra of these stars, they found that these were at great distances beyond the Milky Way. And this confused astronomers at the time. This was in the 1950s and early 60s. They became known as quasi-stellar objects. We knew they weren't stars. They were far too bright in the optical to be stars at the distance we were measuring. And they had this weird radio emission. What's that all about? As we learned more about how galaxies evolved, we started seeing a guy called Seifert, he started seeing that some galaxies had a very, very bright core relative to the rest of the galaxy. And then we started noticing other features of these galaxies that seemed to correlate between those with the bright cores and those without. And they're now a class of objects we know broadly as active galactic nuclei, but the term quasar is basically the same thing. We tend to reserve it for the brighter ones, but it's the same phenomenon. It is matter actively falling onto a black hole at the centre of a galaxy and radiating high energy radiation away. Now, other effects apart from the heating, because you've got a lot of high intensity radiation, you get what's known as photon pressure. This basically, due to quantum mechanics, photons can have momentum as well as just being a massless particle that carries light. Now, if you've got momentum, that means you're impacting on what your photons are firing at, effectively, or hitting. And this can cause, this basically is in effect a wind, sort of like the solar wind in our solar system, which many of you may have heard, but on a larger scale and more intense. And this can drive gas away from central galaxies and even out of the galaxy entirely, compounding the heating problem that I mentioned earlier. So again, not only do you have heated gas that can't collapse into stars and central galaxies, but also that the amount of gas is being limited because it's being chucked out of that region of the galaxy. And also, and we're not entirely sure how these form, but you do get these jets that I mentioned. Now these jets can also drag material with them, reducing fuel for star formation. We think, and this is very much hypothetical, it's not proven, that these jets are created by magnetic fields within the accretion disk, the disk of matter that's falling into this black hole. but we are in no way certain on that. And this is very much an open problem in the modern astronomy. And apparently I have to say go Jets for the moment. So beyond these supermassive black holes, what else is key in extragalactic astronomy? So you've probably all heard of dark matter. Now dark matter basically is, at the moment it's an explanation rather than a phenomenon. It's a phenomenon, but it's an explanation more than a solution. That doesn't make sense to you. It's an explanation. So in the 1930s and the 1950s, in the 30s we saw galaxy clusters, in the 50s we saw galaxies. We noticed that the orbits of stars around the centres of galaxies and galaxies around the centres of galaxy clusters weren't what we expected. What you'd expect, because is that given the amount of mass that you've determined to be in that cluster or in that galaxy, based on the stars you see, or the total amount of light, which is the southern star light, that the further away from the centre of this object you are, where the mass is concentrated, the slower these things should be rotating. It's not what we see. We see that it doesn't trail off at all. So if you look at the plot on the upper right, upper left, you can see there's this smooth red curve of calculated, it's just thrown on background image of the Andromeda galaxy. It's not the rotation curve for that galaxy, but it is a rotation curve for a galaxy. You can see the red curve is what you'd expect from the mass you can see, and the white curve is what you actually measure. And one way to explain this is that there is more mass towards the edge of these galaxies further away from the centre than what you can see. Additionally, this has been backed up by looking at the distribution of mass in galaxy clusters. As I mentioned, the orbits of these galaxies around the clusters have the same sort of feature as the rotation curves of the galaxies themselves. But if you were to determine the mass distribution of a cluster by how light is lensed around that cluster, so what we call gravitational lensing that Michelle was mentioning earlier, the lensing effect is a direct product of the mass, and if you use that to work out what the distribution of mass should be, you find that actually doesn't fit with where the gas is. Now, it does sort of overlap with where the bulk of the galaxies are, but the gas in the cluster can be off quite significantly, and that can't be explained without something like dark matter. Oh, wrong way. That's one phenomenon. And as we've learned more and more about galaxies over the past century, since we really found out that these were phenomena beyond the Milky Way, we've got better and better observations, and we can see now phenomena in other galaxies that we could previously only really see in the Milky Way. And one of these is supernovae. And in particular, there's a type of supernovae that it's called a type 1a supernova, and it's basically when you've got one of these compact objects orbiting another star, and it's drawing gas off of that other star onto the compact object. Once it hits a specific mass, it will no longer be able to support its own weight and will go supernova. And because it has a very specific mass, that means it's going to have a very specific brightness of explosion. And if it's got a very specific brightness, you know exactly how bright it is physically, you can work out how far away it is. An example of a fairly recent one in a nearby galaxy, supernova 1987A, just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? And this was in a Large Magellanic Cloud. There's a before and after picture here. I don't know if people can see the before and after picture. The before picture is on the left, the after picture is on the right, and the after picture contains the image of the supernova. If you can't see, I've highlighted it there in green, should clarify it. But what we were finding when we looked at these type 1a supernova in distant galaxies was that we were finding this, the distance measurements we were getting from them didn't add up to the distance measurements we were using from other methods such as redshift. In fact, specifically redshift. Now, redshift is an implied distance based on a velocity. And as we mentioned before, when you look in any direction, the velocity of a galaxy from its redshift increases the further you go away. And obviously the universe is expanding. But what this distance yardstick told us was that the further you go away, the discrepancy in, well, the discrepancy increases between the redshift distance measurement and the type 1a supernova distance measurement. And actually it turns out that if these are both correct measurements, and we believe they are, then the universe in earlier times was expanding not as rapidly as it is today. Or put another way, the expansion of the universe is accelerating. Now this is puzzling. Firstly, if you imagine the Big Bang as an explosion, and you shouldn't because it's a very bad model, but most people generally do. If you imagine an explosion, you've got an output of energy, and then that energy sort of wanes away. Now, as that energy wanes away, other forces are going to take over that might naturally be there. In the case of the universe, it's full of mass. Mass gives you gravity. So what you might expect to happen is as this energy from the Big Bang dissipates, gravity might take over and the universe might collapse in on itself. Slowly, but might start to collapse in on itself. And what we're seeing is the complete opposite of that, and we can't explain that. This implies that there is energy being added after the explosion has occurred. Again, I use the term explosion as an allegory more than anything. And we've called this phenomenon dark energy. And we've called it that because literally we're completely in the dark about it. Nobody has any idea. When it comes to dark matter, we've got theories. So, for instance, one of the leading theories for dark matter is a type of particle called a WIMP, weakly interacting massive particle. Also quite cowardly, but because that doesn't interact with the electromagnetic spectrum, we can't see it. But it does have mass, so it can explain dark matter in a way. We should be seeing evidence for WIMPs in particle accelerators, but as yet have not. Michelle's around somewhere, and she is a particle physicist, so she probably knows a lot more about WIMPs than I do. But when it comes to dark energy, nah, nothing. Anybody's got any answers? Nobel Prizes are waiting. There's a significant cash portion to that prize as well, if it helps. So, just mention this, as you increase your time since the Big Bang, the acceleration of the universe, the expansion of the universe accelerates. So, this gives us a picture of the universe, where we've got dark matter and dark energy. And it turns out these actually count for a lot of the mass-energy budget of the universe. Now, from Einstein's E equals mc squared, we know that mass and energy are equivalent. So you can combine them into one budget. In effect, it's like taking, I don't know, say, Canadian dollars and British pounds. They're different, but they're also the same. You can exchange them. Although, not very well at the moment from my perspective. And it turns out that dark matter of the matter budget, not the energy budget, dark matter accounts for a good 3/4 of that matter budget. Once you combine them all into the same bank account, as it were, into the same mass energy budget, you find that 95% of all the matter in the universe has to be described by either dark energy or dark matter. 95%. That means we can only really say anything with any level of certainty about 5% of the universe, which is somewhat embarrassing to a professional scientist. Now that 5% is made up of, there's a few heavy elements, but they literally don't make up much. There are stars, there are planets, but it's almost all hydrogen and a little bit of helium. But then you've got like 23% dark matter and 70% dark energy. And basically, this leaves us in a picture that we don't really know what's going on with the universe, is the take-home message, effectively, from this talk. So I'm going to summarise very briefly, and I have no idea how long this is taking, so somebody tell me in a minute. Current understanding of extragalactic astronomy is we know there are 2 trillion galaxies at minimum in the universe. That was worked out about 3 years ago as a lower limit based on what we see looking back about 10 billion years. We know that each of those galaxies consists of hundreds of billions of stars, and we know that the universe has been expanding since the Big Bang nearly 14 billion years ago. We also know that the study of galaxies has taught us that we don't know anything about the universe effectively. So, take that as you will. I will leave for questions. Thank you very much.
All right, do you have any questions? Oh, we do.
I just had a question about the, you said that there's galaxies that the star formation was in the center. Is there any explanation for that?
Yes, so one of the reasons we think is, so star formation should occur relatively randomly within a galaxy, and we think it stops in the centre first in some galaxies because the centre of the galaxy is heated first by these quasars.
Right.
And also, I suppose also you could say that when gas falls onto a galaxy, it's going to fall onto the outside first. That might have some impact, thinking about it, as to why you get higher star formation at the edge of some of these galaxies rather than the centre. The gas just hasn't had time to funnel down towards the centre of the galaxy. But I think the main explanation that we're going with at the moment is that these active galactic nuclei, these quasars, heat up and blow gas away from the centre of galaxies, so there's no fuel and there's no engine.
Right, sorry, I meant the galaxies where the star formation still is.
Oh, right, sorry. Okay, so these quasars only occur for a short period of time. So that means for the vast majority of galaxies, they're not undergoing this phase of evolution, which means you don't have this heating, which means you can allow gas into the centre of these galaxies. You can allow that to collapse.
Thank you.
No worries. Hi.
If you back up a bunch of slides there, or images, there was the new black hole image.
That one, yeah.
Yeah, and at the bottom there, the third sentence says density comparable to area at sea level for the most.
I forgot to mention that. Yeah. So.
Am I reading that right?
Yes. Yes.
Am I understanding that right?
You are. So I mean, this is true, but it's a misrepresentation. You see this in the news that so it's a lot of physics students are taught that supermassive black holes, particularly when they get to sort of advanced undergraduate, taught that supermassive black holes can have densities lower than water, which sort of you think, hang on a second, black holes are really, really dense objects that have to warp space-time. What happens is that because these are so large, the event horizon is so large, it's an average density of matter. What's actually happening is you've got all the density in the middle, and it's much, much more dense than, say, the weight of a battleship or a teaspoon or whatever the typical analogy is. You've got all that density in the very, very centre, but as you were seeing this sort of, that's your typical, if you were to look at the plane, the rubber plane that Michelle was talking about earlier of space-time, and light falls in here basically in a black hole, right? With supermassive black holes, what you're getting is you're getting this gentle curvature, but you're still getting this dip down here. My drawing's awful, but when you get to around here, light still can't escape, but your density around here is actually very, very low. All your density is at that single point in the centre.
So that's the mean average between the most dense and the most...
It's exactly,
the
it's
most
just an
sparse.
average. But it's a neat little sort of, wait, that can't be right sort of thing to think about. I think it's pretty cool anyway. I think you'll have
If all galaxies are rotating and you've got this tremendous gravitational pull in the center where the black hole is, will all spiral galaxies eventually evolve into ellipticals?
That's a good question. We think that elliptical galaxies are older and more evolved galaxies. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, the spiral structure is very, very delicate. It requires preferred direction for angular momentum. Whereas with elliptical galaxies, the orbits are all over the place in order to give you this elliptical shape, so that if you've got galaxy mergers, you're going to disrupt your disk. We also know that even if you don't have mergers, the disk part of the galaxy starts to fade away after time. So if you're not adding new gas to build up that disk, I think the answer is basically yes to your question. It's certainly bulge-dominated, what we call lenticular galaxies. And they do look very, very similar to ellipticals. So yes.
Yes, the black hole at the center of our galaxy, Sagittarius A, has stars rotating around it. And I would suppose that from time to time one would be ejected from the galaxy itself.
Possibly, yes.
So I would just wonder if we would consider orbiting such a star in anticipation of that. To have a power source and be able to achieve intergalactic travel.
I'm not 100% sure of the practicalities of that. I mean, in terms of potential energy, there would be a potential energy source for sure. Practically, in terms of getting to a star that's well, so Sag A is about 30,000 light years from here. The fastest objects we've got at the moment are the Voyager probes, and they're taking 30 years to reach 150 astronomical units, which is what, about, I think, a fifth of a light year. I don't think it's practical. As a hypothetical idea, I'm not 100% sure, but maybe. Yes?
This might be a bit of a chicken and an egg question, but if you were to just give us the history of a typical galaxy, where does the black hole come in?
Oh, that is a good question. That's also what I don't really know the answer to. Okay, so I think to answer that you need to know where the black hole is formed, the supermassive black hole is formed, and the answer to that is we don't know how supermassive black holes are formed. From a naive perspective, one could imagine that you've got this black hole as a seed and then the matter falls all around it and you get that a little bit. But this is very much not known. So I really don't have a good answer for you on that one, I'm sorry.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I got one. I've kind of always wondered, like, if two black holes get close to each other, I've been told that they actually merge.
Yeah.
But why would that be when they're supposed to design to pull?
Sorry, could you repeat the last sentence?
Well, I mean, like they're dense, so and if they're able to pull apart stars and such, then when two black holes get close to each other, why don't they pull apart as opposed to pull and merge?
Okay.
Like
so the thing is, the actual matter that would be pulled apart is actually is in an infinitesimally dense point at the centre of that black hole. There's actually there's not going to be any matter at the event horizon. well, apart from what's just fallen in. Because nothing can travel faster than light, once it's beyond the event horizon, it can't be moved it can't be moved away from the black hole. So if you've got two bodies where they are, everything inside them effectively is permanently locked there, they can only merge, they can't strip apart. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Excellent.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Gail, for the lovely treats. Oh, okay, great. All right, thanks for everyone coming out. We'll continue on the discussion at the Boston Pizza at Hamburg this time. Got it straight. Hey, we'll see you in the next meeting. Thanks, everyone.